Oh, there it is. Okay, sorry. Good morning, everyone, and thanks, Tim, for your comments. When, in the concluding paragraph of Dietary Guidelines for Sustainability, Joan and I wrote the following. It is clear that sustainable diets, even if widely adopted, will not lead automatically to a sustainable agriculture. What is required for widespread adoption of the latter is a farm policy that rewards agricultural practices conserving of natural resources, and an overall policy, both domestic and foreign, that promotes regional self-reliance in food both here and abroad. So over 25 years later, I think we can say that while there has been some progress, and I'll mention a little bit of that later, we are still quite far away from either of these policy goals. This morning, I want to address three different policy elements. What can we learn, building on what Tim has just eloquently gone through, what can we learn from Europe? At least what are a few of the things I think we need to learn from Europe? Some new policy approaches, and I do want to end with some specific policy targets to ground what we're thinking about some. The first of the key learnings that I think we take from the European experience so far is that we have a great need in the U.S. for a changed consciousness among policymakers and regulators of the linkages between food choices and environmental integrity, and then the willingness to act on that consciousness and knowledge. This would include, at a minimum, the following: recognizing the food system as a complex system, containing multiple feedback loops that can't be addressed successfully only in its constituent parts. It also means an acknowledgement that sustainable diets are an appropriate policy and public health goal in the U.S. I think that we all recognize that a portion of the food industry, of many civil society organizations in the United States, of many authors, of many people working on local and regional food, is way ahead of most of the policymakers on this topic. There's a great distance to go, but these pioneers, both in the industry and in the NGO world, will make very good private sector partners for work that the government might do. The second lesson that I take, of course I'm extremely interested in planning and always have been, is the work from Europe, including at FAO, is the need for very good planning for all of this. Despite the fact that the DEFRA work is kind of submerged at this point, on their website you can still find a 2012-2013 evidence plan, which is fabulous reading. It's extensive, it incorporates myriad components and 6 different themes. I think the themes that Tim just showed us. The FAO Sustainable Diet and Biodiversity Report is the result of the coordination of multiple efforts and institutions around the world, not just in Rome. So let me contrast this with the U.S. situation, where there has been no attention that I know of by the agencies developing federal dietary guidance to the environmental implications of food choices. Nor is there, in fact, in the U.S., a food system policy framework that would provide a starting point for looking across agricultural and food sectors rather than keeping them in all of their silos. And I will mention here and later that the fact that there's no food system policy framework was eloquently discussed multiple times in 1982. And the most important report was written by GAO at that point. The third thing that I take away for various reasons is the status of evidence-based research across Europe and some of it here. There already is quite a lot of evidence on the environmental consequences of food production, processing, and delivery, and we heard a lot of that yesterday, and a lot more, especially in Europe, where that came from. There are a number of gaps. I mean, there are way many gaps. There's a lot of research to do, And I'm going to start using the DEFRA terminology about research that needs to be done. They call it underdeveloped. So there's a lot of underdeveloped research. And so far, and I take this from the wonderful Dietary Guidelines report from the Netherlands, most of the recommendations would need to be qualitative due to so much statistical uncertainty in terms of a lot of the research that's being done on greenhouse gas emissions and a lot of other things. But qualitative starts is good. It's still good. It's not, we'll get to the quantitative. The report from the Netherlands does point out, however, something else that I think is really important, is that many of the ecological indicators that we have about the effect of dietary choices on agriculture are correlated. And they've done the correlations, and they have the strength of the correlation because so many of the environmental problems arise from meat production. A large array of them arise out of meat production. So that helps move along some of the scientific thinking about this. The key point in all these lessons is that while there are differences in the U.S. situation, lots of differences, so many thoughtful and useful data analyses, logic models, and plans compiled by our old world colleagues, if I can refer to you as that, are available to us, giving us a head start on a number of complicated questions. So the second element I want to talk about are new policy approaches, both transformative and interconnected. And the two are clearly related. I mention these recognizing, and this is still a little surprising, and I think you can say concerning, recognizing that the idea and the reality of wicked problems, complex adaptive systems, cross-disciplinary research, systems science, a whole field of systems science, and multiple other concepts have been with us for decades and are found in some places inside multiple academic disciplines, multiple organizations across the U.S. Yet surprisingly, little of what has become second nature to many food policy analysts seems to have found its way into most government projects. I do want to say that the Institute of Medicine's work on obesity is a really refreshing exception to this. But there are so many useful tools to dig into the issue we have in front of us about building sustainable dietary policy that it's really a shame that more of that is not visible in the work of those scholars inside of the agencies. The second thing is, so having said that, the policy needs that were identified in the fabulous NRC report in 2010 titled Towards Sustainable Agricultural Systems in the 21st Century, which is a very rich, detailed, articulate rationale for increasing the attention and resources going to interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary systems research. I believe very strongly that the same arguments that has been made about agro-system research can be applied to policy work going forward on sustainable diets. In order to provide the supply of foods needed to meet the increased demand, which we hope would come from the development of sustainable dietary guidance, excuse me, among other things, this committee stated that there must be appropriate price signals or incentives to farmers to adopt more resource-conserving production practices. There have to be farm and food policies need to be redrafted so they are less likely to produce unintended consequences that result in less conservation of water, land, etc. And the third thing they suggested is that we need many more policy tools that are politically viable and effective at a landscape level. Except for some policy that relates to watersheds, most of the agricultural sustainable ag policy still is directed at individual farms, which is not a way, it does not bring any kind of systems thinking to that kind of policy, and is very incremental, if not below zero on an incremental scale. We heard a lot of other really good policy ideas yesterday by several speakers, and all of those could be added to a very large agenda, which actually should probably be written down and put out to researchers inside and outside of government as a research policy agenda for getting to sustainable diets. A fairly obvious corollary to what I just said is that transformative research and policy must be carried out by departments, agencies, administrations that are willing to work together on these complex systems and wicked problems. I will point out here that the groundbreaking GAO report published in 1982 stated that from now on their emphasis would be on cross-issue analyses, and they asked the agencies who dealt with issues related to food to consider the same thing. The Foresight report coming out of England on global food states very strongly that interconnected policymaking is of critical importance if any of these problems are going to be addressed, let alone solved. With regard to our topic, multiple agencies need to be looking across food supply chains to comprehensively delineate and share information on energy use, on climate change, on greenhouse gases, on water pollution, on soil erosion, and many other components, and then allow USDA and Health and Human Services to look at this intelligence in the context of dietary guidance. But unfortunately, and I did some research on this, there don't appear to be many models to utilize here. There is the excellent internal work at USDA of people going across all the different agencies in USDA, talking about know your farmer, know your food, talking about local, regional, and national and global food supplies, learning from each other for the first time, being very surprised at what each other is doing. So that's a good model. That's an internal model. There is an external model of the HUD, EPA, Department of Transportation, USDA, Sustainable Communities Planning Grants. And at the beginning of that planning grant program, there wasn't much room for sustainable food. But as that program has gone along, it has been added. So that's something that we have available to us. But clearly, we need many, many more models of successful collaborations across government agencies, between government agencies and NGOs, any kind of collaboration that you can think of that might move this along. So let me finish by looking at specific policy targets, and of course I'll start with the dietary guidelines. Excuse me. Here are a few pieces of a much, much, much more complex process, I know, that might be considered by the Dietary Guidelines Committee. First is to add members to the committee with knowledge of sustainable diets, that is, with expertise on how diet and food choices interact with agricultural and environmental resources, and what that whole range of policy, education, science, et cetera, looks like. The second thing is to develop a working definition for dietary guidance, and specifically for the purpose of dietary guidance. I don't believe that working definition can include everything that we talk about as a possible sustainable diet. The FAO definition I perceive as a wonderful long-term goal, but I think we could start with smaller things, mainly with environmental sustainability as it relates to the advice that we give people about their diet. Then there would be an evidence review of all the evidence available, and perhaps just on one or two guidelines, the way the Dutch have started. just looking at a couple of things. And then adding more as the evidence base, as the push from policymakers, from consumers, from scientists, et cetera, moves ahead to do it that way. And yes, and to start and add. A second policy target absolutely is research. And there's, although a lot of people talked about research yesterday, and Jennifer will do a lot more, these are policy targets about research. And of course, I stand here saying this in the midst of a really bad set of circumstances around the Farm Bill, about our next Farm Bill, about sequestration, about economic issues, about, and a few other things I'll mention right now. In the NRC report on 21st century agriculture, they said over and over again, there's a lot of urgency here, people. We have to accelerate the progress on research that is going to get us, mainly they were talking about a sustainable agriculture and a resilient agriculture, not the same, but also sustainable dietary guidance. There has to be more government funding for research. The reports over the last 2 years from an interesting array of sources, the American Enterprise Institute, the President's Council on Science and Technology, and Agree, all stated that much more agricultural research has to be funded by the federal government, because a great deal of the research on environmental improvements to agricultural production does not have a high commercial value. So this research is not going to be done at the level of the food industry, where other types of research is being done. More need now for government funding of research perhaps than at any time. And yet, we're in trouble in terms of what the budgets are looking like there. The research needs to be both basic and applied, but strongly oriented to multiple dimensions of sustainability and resiliency, and done by multi- and transdisciplinary teams of people. And of course, ideally, I would add again, this would be cross-agency research. That would be so cool. The last thing is that the research has to explore systems properties, which we now actually know quite a bit about. We need to do a lot of research if we're going to find emergent properties, and we know for sure that if we look carefully enough, there are emergent properties when you take a systems view of food systems. I think of a fabulous paper done a couple of years ago out of Ohio State University, where they did landscape as well as actual agro-practice research simultaneously, and saw an emergent property of what the farmers thought about in those areas where they were doing good ecosystem practices. Another policy target, and this may be, I don't think this will be a surprise to most people in the room, I want to bring up the Conservation Stewardship Program. The reason is, this is a grant program, a very large array of conservation goals you can see here. There is a payment limit. The funds can be used for technical and financial assistance. If current appropriations are continued for CSP, by 2018, approximately 10% of U.S. farmland could be enrolled in this program. But the if is a very big deal and a very big problem. I mention it because I mention CSP because it is the program right now, or it would be something that looks very much like this in the future, that is required, not just necessary, I mean, it's absolutely required to provide the incentives for farmers to adopt conservation practices. And this is by far the best model we have at this point to do that. But some of the appropriations for this program are on the chopping block in what might be a new farm bill. And not only is, I mean, that's not good, but if we, again, if we want to have the foods that will produce, if we want to have a supply of foods that will meet the demands that we hope will arise by better dietary guidance, then we have to make sure that these programs are in place. So let me finish with a couple of observations about, basically about dietary guidance. It's a tool to do a number of different things. Educate the public about food choices, very simply. Even better, effect change in food choices. And we have a mixed history on dietary guidance in the U.S. changing food choices. But it doesn't mean we don't have to do it anyway. And there have been some successes. If we were to incorporate environmental concerns into dietary guidance in the U.S., then it also becomes a tool to educate the public about the entire food system and its utter dependence on ecological health, which some people know. There's been a lot of work by a lot of nonprofits, a lot of other people. Some people know, but a lot of people, that's not embedded. It's not integrated into their frames yet. But dietary guidance is something else. It's also a signal that the government recognizes its role to provide the best food and dietary advice to the public as part of the role of government in protecting the public's health. It's a signal that the government recognizes the links among health, environment, and food security. And I mentioned food security here because when I talked to the Food Forum in October, I said to them that I felt that we probably couldn't talk about food security anymore without recognizing that the agro-environmental health is essential to national food security in any country. Often productivity is the only thing that's looked at. We know the Defense Department is looking at many other things, including climate change right now, and I believe that all of us have to be recognizing the role that, that maintaining environmental resources for agricultural production, which includes land, is a part of national food security. The dietary guidance is finally a signal that the public has a role, that they're not bystanders, that in conserving natural resources through its food choices. Now, people have been saying this for decades and decades, but if dietary guidelines were to move through to putting environmental guidance into the dietary guidelines, then this would be, again, not just an educational tool, but a symbol and a signal of what we think is important. So at that point, I will look forward to your questions.